This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with renowned artist Joel Shapiro. In his sixth decade of studio production, Shapiro continues to push the boundaries of form, movement, and space in his sculptural practice. In the conversation, we discuss the nature of his work in his latest show at Pace, which demonstrates his continued ability to transform basic geometric shapes into dynamic, expressive works that engage both the viewer and the surrounding environment. And now, an exploration of form and figuration with sculptor Joel Shapiro. Joel Shapiro, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Joel, you have a new show coming up at Pace's 508 and 510 West 25th Street Galleries in New York. The show is called Out of the Blue. That's going to be running from September 13th to October 26th. And Joel, a lot of times when I talk to artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone you've never met before who has no idea who you are. Where do you start to describe to them the nature of your work and what it looks like?
I open up my telephone, show them a picture, because it's just too difficult. It's too difficult to talk about, and they don't know what you're talking about anyway. So show them a picture. And, I think, form has some universal misunderstanding or understanding. Either they respond to it. But then if they're curious, I would talk.
But, I've heard you speak before about how the role of an artist or a role of a sculptor isn't just about creating form. It's creating the spaces where those forms interact. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sculpture occupies space. In theory, one would like it to do something to amplify a situation rather than be an obstacle or be, something that obstructs you from going somewhere or doing something. I think you're always functioning, in the real world. It's not illusionistic the way painting is. So, you always have to deal with the physicality of space. And of course, I'm not talking about the space within the piece. You can have negative space within the piece. There's all kinds of spatial situations that occur.
How has your approach to space changed over the course of your career? Because, you're coming out of NYU in the late 60s. It was very much a time of minimalism. How has your approach changed or evolved over the years? Or do you feel like it's been rather consistent?
Well, no, I think the first work I showed, I had an exhibition at the Paula Cooper Gallery. Maybe it was at the Clock Tower. I did the first show at the Clock Tower, and I had a machine. It was about maybe a 20-inch piece that referred to a bridge. It was made out of cast iron, and it was machined. So at that point, it was in this large space with a big spiral staircase. And I think, that my feeling about size and scale at that point was that the size and scale should be appropriate to whatever content you were trying to deal with or almost emotion you were trying to deal with. So the pieces tended to be small with a larger reference to something larger in the real world. So they kind of condensed space. So you'd have this big space and zoom would come, or a small chair on the floor. They actually worked. After, the issue is, okay, so you're in an emotional state, you make those, you show them, then 10 years later, you exhibit them again. Do they do the same thing? They actually do the same thing. They can recall that situation. So I think that work was really about a kind of condensing and reference beyond the piece.
Those pieces would not have read the same way if you had chosen to put them on top of a plinth.
No, they wouldn't. Well, no. I mean, I think they'd become objects. If the plinth was big enough, it might work. I mean, a base, if it's big enough, becomes its own world, and you see the piece in that world, in the world of the base, kind of, or the area of the base. But I was interested in insisting on my own point of view in ambient space, in the existing space. And once you put something on a base, you're isolating it, which is interesting. I don't think there's been a big change. So this show, these are large painted wood sculptures. Uh, they're very active in space, but they're really not so specifically about memory. I mean, they're much more in the present tense.
In many ways, it's a bit of a return for you to pieces that actually are, well, for lack of a better word, grounded. And I know that the ground is something that you have kind of been in a battle with for a couple of decades. Can you kind of talk about your work with pieces that, like these, how you kind of diverged into things that were more floating in space, and now back to kind of re-examining this?
Well, I mean, I was really interested. I had an exhibition. I was looking at, this is sort of, it must have been the late 70s, and things were placed on the floor. And I got to the point where I was began to be so curious to what extent, the floor and the wall, or let's really condition the nature of form. Otherwise, if you build, I mean, the simplest thing would be you building something on a tabletop, right? So that ground where you start affects and conditions the whole piece. And I remember looking at things like that, and then I'd turn one upside down, and it was infinitely more interesting. So, I mean, the floor and the wall and the table are very much like a frame. It's a limitation of possibility. And I wanted stuff that really transcended that wasn't so conditioned by it. I mean, you could do it emotionally, or you could do it structurally, or you can do both. There was a certain point where I began suspending pieces, which were entirely dependent on the architecture, but they weren't, you would read them against the flatness of the wall and the flatness of the floor. And in a certain way that animated them. But if it was laying on the floor, it wouldn't do the same thing, or suspended from the wall. So yeah, the way gravity influences form is really interesting. These pieces in this show, and I actually began to make work. The way I was making a lot of work is I would select so many elements of work, I would attach them by wire or string, and then I'd start to organize them in the most capricious way. I found a configuration that had some meaning. And that was all like after 9/11. And I always said, artists screwing around with collapse and this and that doesn't mean much when you actually see collapse. So I was sort of literally more interested in, so I remember joining 3 or 4, maybe 10 pieces together, and each one was stapled and there was wire, and I twisted and turned it and flipped it. It was all happening in the air. When I found the form, then I'd put it down. That was one way of overcoming the kind of hierarchical aspect of the floor in terms of organization.
It makes me think of the specific piece that had those forms suspended. And I remember this piece had a white table that was sitting atop It was kind of inverted, but it was sitting atop this bundle of forms and suspended.
Oh, that the piece I showed at Paula's.
Right.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, well, that was it was a table and I had form above it and then I flipped it over or who knows what. It was sort of a play on Cezanne. I mean, it was nice. Very clear statement about that. But I mean, there are always references. I mean, you kind of don't know what you're going to come up with, at least the way so I don't have I don't, I try not to have a preconceived condition point. I mean, I know that, well, yeah, I'm always aware of the limitations of my work, or I try to be, and then you try to push it beyond that, something new. You're not going to find a new individual form, but you can find a language of form using multiple parts that really explores something you're trying to reach, but haven't been able to articulate until you realize it. But that's what's fun. That those are the few and far between moments of rapture or elation, at least elation. I'm not sure if it's rapture, but it keeps you going as an artist, you know. I think de Kooning said every once in a while you get a gift from God. I mean, something happens that you didn't under that where there's this resolution of what you've wanted to do or wanted to be. I mean, it's fun.
So can you think of a handful of your works that you really got that buzz from?
Yeah. I think the little chair on the floor did that. I mean, I didn't, when I first did it, I may have been making doll furniture for my daughter. And I said, I mean, I know I built her a dollhouse and couches and things like that. And then I said, I built this little chair and stuck it in the middle of the space. I think my dog grabbed it and ran away with it, and then I put it back. And then I decided, oh, and then, that was wood. So then I decided to cast that in iron to sort of insist on its meaning, which gave it a certain density and weight. I mean, that was a kind of a moment. Maybe it's a negative moment. I don't know. Anyway, it had a concentration that was interesting. No, I mean, work can be expansive. There are other people that I've done that really do that. Maybe the first figure I did, more figural work, I was working very small. And then there was a moment of elation and I made it larger. I wasn't always convinced that the healthiest place to be was this magical world of small pieces and entering into these bunkerish Alice in Wonderland spaces. I mean, I thought that was too magical. I wanted stuff more in the real world. But the floor was not the solution for me. I think architecture was a real solution for minimalism, but not for my generation. They used architecture, but the work wasn't entirely conditioned by architecture.
Do you prefer to have some idea of a space that your work is going to be in? I mean, do you prefer to make work for a specific space, or do you try to create work that can exist on its own, regardless of where it's going to wind up being placed?
Well, if it's a commission for a specific space, then you deal with the space. And that, to some extent, conditions the size and placement and the scale of the work. But if I'm working in my studio, I mean, the studio to some extent conditions the work. No, I just work. I mean, I would grab, when I'm really working, and I sort of pick up a pin gun and wood. I have a lot of wood laying around. I'll start putting things together. It's very, that moment fairly quick. I mean, there's stages. Well, I'll do it. It may take one day, it may take 5 days. I mean, you're not working 5 days. Looking at it and what does it mean? Does it work? No, I think I just work basically for myself.
Sure.
And the conversation, the broader conversation of sculpture, I guess. Or at least I should say my conversation, because it's not There's not general consensus.
Last year, I had a conversation with Tony Cragg, and it was great talking to him about his process because he's someone who every day he's going through exploratory exercises and drawings, and that provides him some inspiration where he's taking pieces of plywood and kind of stacking them, and he's able to take them off and restack and disassemble and reassemble. Is your process one where you're spotting random pieces and quickly nailing and trying and prying apart and putting back together, or are you working in maquettes, or what does your process look like?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of wood. I will confess that I've taken pieces of wood, painted them, chopped them up, on the table saw and chop saw. I have tools downstairs in the main space, and then I have a studio upstairs. And I have all these sticks and pieces and pin guns, and I pull them apart, put them back together until I find something that I like. I never draw. I mean, I draw, but I would say my drawing is really about, I mean, to some extent, drawing doesn't involve the kind of, the physical aspect of making sculpture. So you can do things in drawing that you can't, that would be a big effort to do. It's not mimetic. I mean, it's not, I've never drawn a sculpture, but I would say that I've investigated things in drawing that might be things that I might want to do, but the logistics of building sculpture and the necessity of somebody else working with you, and how do you join the goddamn thing? And since pieces are chunks that are in between, I mean, my problem is I'll build it with a pin gun. Pin guns are really quick. You can get pins up to 2 inches, and so that you can join two pieces that are asymmetrical. You don't have to do facet to facet, which I think is really boring. Facet to facet is again like the floor. The thing might be haptic, it's small, so the pins work. Make that larger, the pins clearly don't work. So I use a lot of wedges to wedge things apart. And then you can go back in and epoxy and slop some epoxy over the pins. So actually that gives it some strength. Yeah, it's very exploratory. I don't have a specific idea of what I'm going to do. And even in a commission, I mean, I don't quite know what I'm going to do. But you could take a piece and adjust it for a different context. But generally, the work is fairly, I mean, I've never really made work for a specific space, but I would choose work according to the context.
So what about material? Because do you always start with wood? I mean, because you're making lots of choices, right? Choices about whether something should remain unfinished, whether it should become painted, whether it should become cast at a foundry. Is it all part of your gut at this point in your life as to how you make those decisions?
Well, I mean, I recently did a wall piece, and I had been saving 6 or 7 colors of wood that would look great. I just know what to do with the damn things because they were more interesting than any form I'd come up with. And finally, I used them. I felt now I'm destroying these nice pieces of wood. And it turned out really interesting. My problem is I put it all together with pin guns into the wall. So now I have to extract the thing off the wall. How? I don't know. I'll worry about that after the show is over. But no, basically I just, I think it's not that different than a kid playing with blocks. I hate to say that, but I mean, the real thing is to, express your intent. I think you can do it with anything. But, I have material around me that I favor, which would be pieces of wood. A lot of it are cutoffs of something else, which are less predictable. I made a recent piece, they were mahogany cutoffs for making another piece and joining those together and looking at them. I mean, I can always come up with something that's, sculptural, but how new it is, I don't always know. So, I mean, as soon as you do it after a while, keep looking. I said, that's boring. That looks like a Tony Smith or something. I mean, it's hard to avoid reference since, there have been thousands of people making stuff, right?
Well, I mean, you always hear musicians talking about how at the core of it, there are only so many chords that you can rearrange.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. Well, no, I don't know, but well, there's a lot you can do with stuff. And you're not going to, that's why the given form, what you begin with is relatively meaningless. It's how they configure in the end, and that's what becomes different or unique.
I heard you say once that material is nature and color is culture. What do you think you meant by that?
Well, I think if you make something out of wood, wood is nature, right? And if you choose, yes, I mean, you can pick, spruce or basswood or whatever, oak. I hate oak. There's too much reference. Uh, I tend to like wood that has less reference. Uh, and then if you paint it, painting is a willful act, right?
Mhm.
You're creating something. Paint's not natural. I mean, I guess if you were painting it with berry juice or something, be natural. But I mean, paint is more intellectual. A color, a pot of red has much deeper, it's really a cultural phenomenon versus a log or a slab of wood.
So basically, an unfinished piece is like a nude, and a painted piece is clothed. There's been some conscious choice made on how to.
Yeah, it's also an envelope. It's an envelope. It denies the wood. It doesn't deny the wood, but obscures the wood. It amplifies the form and, or the joining of form. I don't always paint things. Sometimes I leave them fairly rarely. Even if, I mean, I did one work, it's sort of, where it's kind of a more figural piece, and then the head is painted. And so it's sort of about thought. The rest is body. I don't know. Bodies. Anyway, I mean, I just think it makes a big difference how you paint and whether you reveal the wood or don't reveal the wood, slather it on, and you can unify the form. 18 desperate elements, paint them all one color, and they all, become married to each other.
Like Louise Nevelson, right?
Well, that would be an extreme case. All black,
Right.
black and white.
What will we see at this show? Are you making conscious color choices, or are things exposed? What do we
No,
see?
everything's painted. There may be there's one large piece that's 12 foot tall by 18. I don't know how many chunks are in it. It's really difficult to make. And of course, I made the model small, and the model was very much about compression, where two sides are pushing the inside. And so the translation of that into large in wood, you could rely on pin guns in the small one. And wood, we had to use wedges and, various slip keyhole fittings to put it all together. So everything is painted, but there are certain structural elements inside the piece that you can see that I left as wood because I wanted them to be like the inside of the piece. They're large. It's kind of a wild show. I mean, I'm happy with it, which is rare. They're three pieces, multicolored.
I know with your hanging pieces, and I'm sure with work as large as this piece arc that you were just describing, I know that one of the things you've liked to think about and deal with is how, as you interact in the space, moving through and around it, the piece reconfigures itself. That's something that's unique to 3D art that you're just not going to experience with a painting on a wall, is just how open-ended the experience can be.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think that's true. Yeah, it works in the round. It works, it's looking at a distance is very different than looking up close, but that's true with the painting. Yeah, yes, I mean, sculpture historically and is in, other than relief. Yeah, you can walk around it. You can position, and you can position how the perceiver sees the work. Donatello did that. Did you see the Donatello show in Florence?
I did not.
It's so great. You just know what a genius. I mean, how brilliant. But just the way he would locate how you see the piece. Versus, otherwise, it wasn't just some spiritual engagement with Saint so and so. In fact, I seriously doubt if he had any interest in that. It was like how he's going to force you to confront his work. So you can do that with placement. You can do that with sculpture in the round. Just in terms of if you have a big chunk, something here, you know, that blocks other things, and then you go around and see it. No, sculpture's in the world. It's in the world, it's in our space. Now, hopefully it gives something up, gives something back for its occupation. It all too frequently doesn't, but when it does, it's kind of exhilarating.
So, you were referring to a certain portion of your body of work earlier as being figurative, but it's figurative, yeah, figurative in an abstract sense. And how little reference does it take for something to allude to a figurative body?
Yeah, I think all sculpture has a figural, has a reference to the body. It's made. You can't exclude it, or let's say to a psychological, well, I don't know the right term, but to the psyche of the maker and the body of, so I mean, it all has this human reference. You can't, even in its most reduced state, then that kind of reduction is about how that person thinks and feels and whatnot, or what they're willing to reveal. So, I mean, I think it's very, it's almost it's almost a surrogate of the individual who makes it. I mean, I don't care if it's arch minimalism. It's still it's all about the whole artist. Not so, I mean, it's so in some abstract way, it refers back to the human who made it. And I think psychologically it always does. I mean, I don't want to get into this publicly, but I have my ideas.
A number of years ago, you did an installation at the Musée d'Orsay that was in dialogue with a sculpture by Carpo. How did that opportunity arise? Did you have a piece in mind, or did you create something in response to that
Well,
Carpo
that's an
work?
interesting, I mean, well, I was invited by Serge Lemoine to pick to do something in relationship to the collection. I mean, I've always been interested in Degas, right? So, I mean, I thought about Degas, but, the Degas that really interest me are wax pieces, and that seemed so obvious anyway. And I had looked at the Carpo numerous times and the Gates of Hell. I mean, you can't help it since they're positioned so prominently. And I went back to after trudging through the museum, it was wonderful, you can pick anything. It's like, I actually had a model in the studio that really had so much to do with, or had such a similar configuration. So I don't think there's anything new, right? I think sculptors have been reiterating more or less the same human condition for centuries and in different cultures. I think it passes, it's not specifically about one, the work is specifically about one culture, but the meaning of form, of course, it varies culturally, but that kind of projection. So I had this piece that had a kind of central priapic form and then with a cluster around it. And that had much to do with that literally, when I was talking earlier about things with wire and back and forth. And I must have wrapped this around another form. And that's when I stopped because I thought, oh yeah, that's something. Now, was that influenced by my looking at Carpo years earlier? Who knows? I mean, I don't know how the mind functions. I think it was just a kind of, so that's the piece I chose. Then, of course, it was so big, and then I made the piece larger. Uh, it really worked. I mean, it really referred to the Carpo, I thought. Of course, Carpo is much more complicated, the dance. It's a great sculpture. Carpo is far out, and those both body are great. Of course, the art world, always sees Carpo as as the end of the situation, that there's no forward in the situation. That's how I ended up making that piece. So what's sort of commissioned? Yeah, I would say it was commissioned. But when I found this piece, immediately I knew I can do nothing better than that in relationship, how it related to the corpo. So that sense of continuity between sculpture really interests me. That there's not that much difference between a 19th century work and a 21st century, or the artists, they're not reiterating each other, but the necessity to make work is a common thread between us. Of course, Carpo would roll over in his grave, but that's okay. Uh,
So, in that description, you mentioned wire, and it reminds me seeing photos of an installation you did really early in your career at an HBCU down in Georgia, where you were kind of given a space and you went to the local co-op and bought a huge amount of baling wire and just kind of transformed this space, which, if I think if somebody were to see that image by itself, they wouldn't necessarily tie it to you in your larger body of work. But is it something you've ever thought about going back to or challenging yourself with a material that is outside of your normal use?
well, I was going to, I had a little show at Yale, and Jock Run. I mean, somehow I was going to do that, and I bought all this wire, but man, I just couldn't do it. I mean, at that point when I was doing that, I was stapling a lot of single monofilament dye to the wall. This is work from, I mean, I showed something like that at the anti-illusion show. And when I got down to Jeff Way invited me down, he was teaching, and the baling wire is so malleable. Yeah, I mean, just got in the room and played with it and came up with configurations. I have wire stuff in this show. I mean, where I'm using wire. I use wire, but I don't use wire, as a means of composition. It's more a fact of the making of, having one piece located one place and another piece separated.
We've mentioned that this show doesn't necessarily have a lot of work that's suspended, but there has been a good deal of that in the last decade. And we're talking about wire and suspended work. It makes me think of Calder, and I'm wondering, have you ever been tempted to explore something that was actually more kinetic?
I did one kinetic piece. And I just remembered this because I was the Whitney Museum, before they had the original, this was a prototype of their Whitney whatever the educational program was. So somebody just asked, well, I should yes, I did. I did things where I had three washers moving around the room doing. I mean, this is early on. This had to be 1967 or something, but it was kind of kinderkunst. And Jim Seawright was running the program. There were lots of artists who were invited to work. And I was invited because my wife at the time was a school teacher and she was invited. So I came along too. And I was close with Bob Barry. There were lots of guys down there. And it was interesting. And I did that once. Things were slipping, so it would just move all over the place. But I've never, and that was primitive. I would imagine if you're doing anything kinetic now, with the amount of technology around, you could do anything. It's too complicated. I can barely use my telephone. Being kinetic. I don't mind things swinging in the air. Yes, swinging like Calder. Yeah, well, I admire Calder. I mean, I just think it's kind of a brilliant body of work. I always have. And it was sort of light. And its lightness is what's so profound.
What should people expect when they show up at Pace over the next month? Because I think there's even some smaller work from different decades included.
There's some wire pieces that are suspended. No, they're little models that I've never bothered to make. With this wire, and then there's a plank, and it kind of, if it were outside, I guess it would wiggle around until it broke, until it hardened. So there's a room of three big pieces, and then there's about, I don't know, maybe 14 smaller pieces from various periods of time in the small room that relate to the work outside. Or at least I think they give you a sense of how I organize form insight into that. And there's a lot of color, more on the outside than the inside. So you can see how I work. You get a sense of it.
The show it's installed at this point, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, now at this point that it's installed and you can see these pieces living in an environment, do you have like a seed of motivation for where you go from here? I mean,
well, first I'm relieved that it looks great because I don't care who you are. I don't know. And I know I'm 83 years old, and I don't know how many hundreds exhibitions are. I still get totally anxious and, always expect the worst. Not, it's not going to look good. It's not going to hold up. It looks good in the studio. Now that I painted that, I fucked up this color or this or that. It's not going to blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this show, looks good. Yeah, yes, well, I'll get back to work. I'll take a couple of weeks off. I have lots of work that I haven't realized. I have models and maquettes. And I actually thought I might start to draw again, which I've always seen as a kind of vacation from making sculpture. And ideas that I've seen in the sculpture that, I don't know, I can push it further. I do some drawings.
So what is that time like? Because I think that's pretty common with artists to take 3 or 4 weeks off, after a show. Like, how do you cleanse your palate? Where do you go? Do you not touch anything in the meantime?
No, I'll be going to my studio, but I have other things I have to deal with. Put it like this: we haven't been up to our country house in a year and a half.
Oh my gosh!
I think I better go up there and check it out. There are other things I have to do. That I'll do. And then I'll still be going. I'll be at the studio every day, more or less.
Well, Joel, this has been a real delight getting to talk to you. I wish you the best on this show. I encourage everybody to go out and see it. It's at Pace's 508 and 510 West 25th Street Galleries in New York. September 13th to October 26th. I believe there's an opening reception on the 12th, 6 to 8 p.m. And so I encourage people to come out, and if they're lucky, they get to shake your hand, right?
Right. I'll say hello. I don't know if they'll be lucky. Anyway, this was a pleasure and interesting. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.